there's, okay, recording started. If you have any technical problems, there's someone called tech support, so you can just write them in the chat and they will try to help you with your technical problems. Yes. So now my advertisement, and then we can start. This panel today is part of a series of events under the theme Perspectives on Remembrance. We have a couple of events in Leipzig. They are focusing more on perspectives on the fall of the Berlin Wall out of a migrant perspective, and also the following years of transformations and the uprise of right-wing violence and racism during that time. So if you live in or around Leipzig, you're welcome, and you find more information on our website, revolutionale.de. And we also have more online events. If you don't live in Leipzig, you can join them. There will be another panel about remembrance. It's on October 20th under the theme Burdened Memory, the State of Culture of Remembrance in Hungary. And the last one for this year is in November 3rd, and it's about democracy in Poland, developments in rule of law and civil society in Poland, and you're also warmly invited to join them. More information about that you can also find on our website. Okay, so enough from my side by now. Welcome again to everyone who's joining us. Maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit further now. If you like, you can tell us a bit about your work and maybe why you engage in the field of remembrance. So, Jasmin, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you very much. My name is Jasmin Mujanović. Stated, I'm a political scientist and a policy analyst. I guess concerning specifically the topic of remembrance, most of my work in that context has focused on aspects of historical revisionism and genocide denial, specifically concerning the genocide in Bosnia. But more broadly, I think the extent to which historical revisionism remains kind of a constituent feature, unfortunately, of a lot of nationalist politics in Bosnia in particular, and the region more broadly. And the way in which it remains very much like a active aspect of how a lot of the mainline nationalist parties in Bosnia and Herzegovina continue to pitch themselves to voters and supporters, right? It's a kind of continuous exercise of affirmation to deny the basic facts of the Yugoslav dissolution, but also more broadly, increasingly also, going into the 1940s, the fascist period, and a kind of just wholesale retelling of 20th century history in the Balkans and Bosnia.
Okay, thank you, Jasmin. Maybe you continue, Lejla?
Sure, thank you for the invitation. My name is Lejla Gačanica. As you already said, I'm a consultant and a researcher in the area of dealing with the past, transitional justice, and of course, politics and culture of remembrance. I've been working over 15 years with civil society organizations here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in the region of the Western Balkans. And focus of my work is not only on remembrance itself, like memorials and transitional justice as itself. I work a lot with the young people, and one of the focus of my research is how art can contribute to the dealing with the past, and is there any alternative way to basically establish culture of remembrance different of the official narratives about the war, not only in Bosnia, but as I already said, in the region.
Okay, thank you so much, Lejla, also for giving me context before the talk. That was really helpful. Yeah, Denis, it's your turn.
Thanks so much. So my name is Denis Džidić. I'm the Executive Director and Editor of the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So BIRN works across the region, and transitional justice reporting is one of our key core pillars. Basically, we monitor war crime trials in Bosnia and Herzegovina, many of them across the entire Western Balkan region. We also monitor hate incidents, disciplinary procedures. We report about systematically about all of the issues that are connected to dealing with the past. So memorialization, reparations, lack of reforms that are key to dealing with the past, and just generally lack of any strategic approach to transitional justice in the entire region. My own personal focus has been reporting about war crime trials in The Hague and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and generally reporting about the intersection between media and propaganda connected to revisionism and denialism related to war crime trials.
Okay, thank you so much again. So I thought, as I don't know the level of knowledge of everyone who's listening to the talk, I would try to briefly break down some basic information about Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's just an attempt of an overview, so please correct or complete me afterwards. Yes. So, Bosnia and Herzegovina as a state of today exists since 1995 and is a successor state of the former Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. During the 1980s, the political system of Yugoslavia got more and more delegitimized and ethno-nationalist movements were on the uprise. The first regions declaring their independence succeeding out of Yugoslavia were Slovenia and Croatia in 1991. Also in these times, in the 1990s, several wars broke out in the region. Same in Bosnia, after a referendum held in March 1992 in Bosnia, in which more than 60% of the voters voted for independence from the by then mainly Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia. The war broke out also in Bosnia. On the area of Bosnia-Herzegovina were three major ethno-nationalist parties, like the Bosnian Serbs, the Muslim Bosniaks, and the Croat Bosniaks. And during the war, there was also genocide happening. The murder of about 8,000 Muslim Bosniaks following the Serb conquest of the Eastern Bosnian UN-protected zone of Srebrenica in July 1995 is sadly representative of the many genocidal crimes and war crimes committed. The war ended by the Dayton Peace Agreement, in which Bosnia and Herzegovina was established as a state composed in two highly autonomous entities, the Republika Srpska, which is like Bosnian Serb Republic, and the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a decentralized federation of Croat and Bosniaks. Each entity has its own legislature and president. There's also a third unit in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is the Britsko district, which has his own local government. And the central institutions of Bosnia and Herzegovina include a directly elected 3-member presidency, which rotates every 8 months between a Bosniak, a Serb, or Croat member. And the presidency, as the head of the state, appoints a multi-ethnic council of ministers. So far of the organization of today, and might try to break down some informations. Yes, Lejla, you wanted to start and to give some context of the topic of memories, remembrance, and maybe you can also complete or correct to what I just said.
Thank you. I will start. There is nothing to correct. Basically, I will just try to expand what you just said on the context in terms of how remembrance looks like in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As it was announced during this preparation for this event, we consider how important basically is to ask the question, what is remembered and who is remembering? And this is very much along the sides, or let's say borderlines that you just mentioned. Dayton Peace Agreement, of course, established the peace, but also gives some kind of basics and some way of internal purpose and possibilities ground for continue this remembrance, which is quite divided in Bosnia and Herzegovina along the ethnic lines. So when considering remembrance in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I think we should have in mind that there are at least 3 official narratives about the war, and of course about the past. These include character of the war, role of each ethnic community, reasons, but also results of the war, and also not only these, let's say, facts, but also fabricated myths, numbers, and also interpretation of certain events. What actually links these 3 official narratives is the fact that they are mutually exclusive. They are contested and based on ethnic identity. This is visible in, I would say, almost all segments I mentioned, and that includes who is victim, who is hero, what happened, to whom, and definitely why. So when trying to answer what and who remembers, I think that depends on affiliation on the first place to the ethnic group. But also I need to emphasize that this is also related to official narratives, and I'm not talking about culture of remembrance, and I'm not talking about broader picture of remembrance, but only what is presented within these official narratives and politics of remembrance in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And these have been actually established by political elites and translated very skillfully by using education, media, political power, but also governmental power from the war to today. Ethnic identity, which I just mentioned, and which overgrown, or maybe it's not fully correctly to say replaced joint Yugoslavia identity, is now determination factor when it comes to remembrance. In a very simplified version, and I would like to emphasize this, for each ethnic group, as you said, Croats, Bosniaks, and Serbs, enemy is other 2. So victims are only from our group. War crimes and criminals are only from other 2 groups. No crimes were committed by our members, nor in our name. So this is common and leading line in all 3 politics of remembrance in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Until last year, when the changes of criminal law were imposed by High Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina, denial of war crimes and glorification of war criminals were very publicly pronounced and include naming the streets, public institutions, painting murals, holding commemorations, and many other forms of remembering politics. And this was basically for convicted war criminals. There were no sanctions, there were no bans, there were nothing that could prevent these kind of events. And one could see here that public spaces, beside all these other tools that I mentioned, as a significant part of remembering politics, also were directed towards narratives which aimed to preserve contested interpretation of war facts, which are established in criminal proceedings, and I'm sure Denis will tell more about this, but also to preserve animosity and ethnical hate among the population. This is in particular dangerous, and I want to emphasize this in small local communities where, for example, we have returnees who suffered during the war and now are trying to renew their lives. For them, this means to meet your own trauma on the daily basis, looking in celebration of war crimes and not getting acknowledged their own suffering and constantly, unfortunately, maintaining the fear among the people and among ethnic communities. So trying to define what is remembered, it is also necessary to observe lack of critical remembrance. There is very fragmented and weak attempts to incorporate negative remembrance into official narratives. On crimes of one's own ethnic group or army, we can use either narrative, either term, non-narrative speaks about. So what we are facing there is even more disturbing than denial. It is a silence. And I want also to emphasize here that I believe that silence will basically cover up many stories that should be told and remembered. And now, 27 years after the war, individual memories from survivors, witnesses, bystanders are disappearing by natural limitation of humans' lives. People die, and of course with them, if not preserved somewhere, individual suppressed memories will die too. So there we can see the discontinuation of remembering, which needs material or ceremonial shape, reminder, repetition in terms to be remembered or preserved. Each choice of what to remember contains also a choice what to forget. So in B&H, I would say this takes extremely ethno-nationalistic format. So talking about also what is remembered, I would say that the little changes and improvements are visible. And that is actually a result of 27 years of repetition of memories about the past, but also using very powerful tools to keep it alive. Sometimes it seems almost impossible to change or to penetrate to the official narratives. We are witnessing that even right now at this very moment, because pre-election period recently started and political parties will bring again heavy narratives, warnings, language, interpretation, but also symbols of the past and promote politics of ethnic separation instead of joint future. And not to finish on this like very depressive and not optimistic line, I want to refer to a glimpse of hope for which I believe all of us are sitting here. And that would be, let's say, fourth narrative, and for sure, definitely alternative narrative about the past. It comes from solidarity, from truth-seeking, testimonies of survivors, critical remembering, but also counter-memorials, right to truth, preventing conflict, peace building. I know it seems all like a big words, but they are all definitely persistent during this 27 years. And also, I want to say that it's not easy to make a difference nor to speak outside of the ethnic narrative. And this carries, I would say, some kind of consequences that makes you personally or on the organizational level as an enemy, as a traitor, as a Western player. But at the same time, it is only way to imprint in the collective memory, at least piece by piece, the silenced voices that are not fitting into ethnically clear narratives about the past. It is definitely a long way, but it is also swimming against the current, and there is no success basically guaranteed. So I would say small steps, both in local communities, but in political and societal level has to be done. And many civil society initiatives does remarkable steps with youth, with memorials, with commemorations, intervention in public spaces, not formal in education, and all of these are definitely alternative places and spaces to promote different narratives. But as an alternative, their space for action is limited, but at the same time, it makes sense because provides safe space from nationalism and separatism. And this is, I want to also emphasize, is in particular important for young people from Bosnia and here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And all of this basically leads me to the question, who remembers? So who remembers is also important when we talk about what is remembered. And people who experience the war here, they do remember. Their lives are created around that experience. They have been reminded on that every single day, not to forget, which leads us back to the instruments of official remembrance politics and usage of the remembrance in political purposes. But I should also mention here a fail of transitional justice mechanisms to provide satisfaction and reparation as well. So combination of these two are definitely determine who remembers and how it remembers. And when it comes to young people, I would like to say that those who do not have personal experiences of war, they generally are fed up with all of this. It is omnipresent and yet not understandable, not inclusive, not questioned, and not open for them. They are expected just to take over the narrative and continue the repetition. And I wouldn't dare to say it does not work. It does to a certain point. But when working with young people, I often hear we are not interested in war, nor remembrance, nor your reconciliation, because they see this war as someone else war, and basically attempts or persisting on reconciliation as something that they should not do because they were not part of the war. They are basically interested for their future, and what they repeatedly see is that future, same as the past, is very much defined by someone else's past. I hope he did this give a bit more of context to what you already say, and I will definitely stop here and looking forward for the discussion.
This definitely gave more context. Thank you. I'm not sure. Yeah, I will keep my questions for later. And yeah, maybe everyone else already has questions too. Dennis, you said that you're working in the media sector. You monitored war crime trials internationally, but also in Bosnia. Yes, and you also write a lot about transitional justice. So maybe you can tell us a bit about your work and yeah, about the situation of the media and how what is the role of media coverage in all this remembering topic.
Yeah. So first of all, let me just start by saying that this is an amazing overview by Lejla. This basically captures really the situation where we are, the amount to which ethnic nationalism and memory has really captured the state. And Jasmin's introduction also explained how big of a role denial of genocide, denial of war crimes, and revisionist narratives are dominant in the country. Now, to your question, how they are so dominant is through basically media and social media. And we are basically living in a captured state. So when you talk about the theory of transitional justice, you have the 4 pillars. So right to justice, right to truth, right to reparations. And then the 4th is guarantee of non-repetition or institutional reform. Basically, this 4th pillar, we've never really even in any kind of way implemented systematically. There has been no attempt to systematically address the past or the legacies of the past, because basically we're living with the same or extremely similar nationalistic elites that we have been living with since the early 90s. And obviously it's not in their self-interest to address the legacies of the past. It's in their self-interest to perpetuate these ethnic divisions and to rule their own ethnic groups by basically relying on mobilization through fear. And the easiest way to do that is by revisionist narratives, by denial of war crimes, by glorification of war criminals. And that happens primarily through media outlets. It happens predominantly by public broadcasters, which are basically propaganda tools for the leading politicians here. We are currently in a pre-election campaign, and BIRN is one of the media that's kind of systematically monitors. And just as an example, when you look at the times that the public broadcaster is giving the main Bosnian Serb political candidate, Milorad Dodik, the amount of time he has on air compared to the next person who's also from his political party is 5 times more. And you know that public broadcasters have rules and regulations in place that they should give all candidates the exact same time. Now, basically, that's where we are living that's what we are living. That's the reality to which even public broadcasters, which should kind of address the public good, are being absolutely manipulated. Now, when you talk about the private media sphere, they're also predominantly politicized through either they're owned or financed by political parties, or they are reliant on funding or commercials or support by predominantly public companies or privately owned companies that here in the country is so captured by political by ethno-nationalist political elites is the biggest private companies are also affiliated to political parties. So basically what we end up having is a community or a group of communities, however way you want to look at it, and Lejla addressed that we are living in a situation where we do have an extremely complex governing system, but even if it's a community of a group of communities or a single community, they are misinformed. They are the victims of systematic disinformation. And basically, the predominant disinformation is related to wartime atrocities. And that's what's important, that people have very, very little understanding of what was actually proven in wartime proceedings, and have addressed this issue of transitional justice. When you look at the 4 pillars, Bosnia has only ever really implemented the right to justice. We have had several hundred cases of war crimes prosecuted. So we do have a significant amount of court-determined facts that basically tell us what has happened in most areas of the country. The problem is that this is not part of official curriculums in schools, so the institutional memory is not being taught. It's certainly not part of the main narratives that are being driven by politicians and through the media. And basically, there is very little knowledge of that. And very little interest from the side of authorities to actually engage with that and to use it as a platform to create something that would be similar to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. BIRN for the last 2 years has been developing a database that is going to drag out court-determined facts of all regions for the Bosnian War based on completed war crime cases. And basically, we've already started contacting cantonal and entity level ministries of education to ask them whether there is an interest to do short videos or any kind of preparation for class material, so that in some way these kind of court-determined facts could be used in curricula, because we've seen political speeches of many politicians saying that, they would be interested in incorporating much more fact-based narratives, but, they don't have the tools. And it's basically just our calls are being ignored. Nobody really wants this. Nobody really wants fact-based discussions. What they want is to perpetuate this propaganda and to have the institutional memory, the community memory, the public memory be flawed, be misinformed, and to use social media specifically to use this information to mobilize voters in different ways. So that's what's happening on the ground, and predominantly the issue of war crime trials, because they are so emotionally charged, because we've had cases related to really high-level commanders and political affiliations. This is a really good tool that's being used by politicians for the purposes that I've just explained. What's also important to add is that we do not have any kind of transitional justice strategy. The issue of dealing with the past, and obviously memorialization as well, is not being addressed systematically at all. And it's gotten to the point where institutionally even there is a move by specifically Republika Srpska authorities, but then also local level authorities on various sides, to really remove remove fact-based narratives from the community, from the ground, from what's visible. So basically, I'll give just a few examples. The Republika Srpska authorities in Bratunac earlier this year have renovated one of the places where genocide in Srebrenica happened. Now, for years before, victims were not allowed at the commemorations to visit this place and to lay flowers and to remember more than 1,000 people killed within the genocide at that particular location. And if that wasn't insult enough or telling enough, this year they've actually painted over it and renovated these halls that nobody uses and that have no particular purpose, just in order to perpetuate these denialist narratives. We also have in local communities in Mostar, Bosnian Croat, authorities refusing victims' requests to visit a location where the Heliodrome camp was, where hundreds of Bosniaks and Serbs were being held in a detention camp in appalling conditions, and some of them tortured, forced to do forced labor, and all of these things. And then finally, just to show you the amount to which this is problematic, the Bosnian State Court, which is a state-level institution, is placed within a complex which used to be a former Yugoslav National Army barracks, which during the war was used as a detention site. Again, some of the people there were abused, some of them were in appalling conditions. The state court, which this highest judicial authority, is refusing to put a plaque, just a plaque to say the basic facts about what this place was used during the war for. So that tells you basically of what the system or systems are doing in relation to memory, and then also how the media is being manipulated to spread those narratives. And I'll stop there to leave place for question and answers, but yeah.
Okay, I think, oh, now my laptop is freezing. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Thank you, Denis. This is, well, yeah, let's talk about this later. Jasmin, you wrote a book. You basically mostly work about politics of post-authoritarian and post-conflict democratization. Your book is called Hunger and Fury, the Crisis of Democracy in the Balkans. Yes, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your research, about your book, and yeah, which role plays which is the link between democratization and remembrance?
Sure, thank you very much. So I wanted to just very quickly kind of go back to something that was kind of said at the very beginning, and only because I think it's kind of topical and it's important that we sort of underline certain facts. So we just had an incident a couple hours ago. We had a campaign rally in the city of Jajce that was where the main Croat nationalist party in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the HDZ, had a campaign rally, and in attendance was also the president of Croatia. So we had received news a couple hours beforehand that the president of Croatia yesterday at the summit in Brdo Brijuni, in the so-called Brdo Brijuni process in Slovenia, had explicitly, in the presence of several other heads of state, including the current chairman of the Bosnian presidency, explicitly denied the genocide in Srebrenica. So he had explicitly said there was no genocide in Srebrenica. In fact, the full quote was, "There are many genocides, but there was no genocide in Srebrenica." This is very significant because then a couple hours later we have this HDZ rally in Jajce, where the presidency candidate of the HDZ says that Bosnia-Herzegovina is a quote unquote state union. This is an interesting term. This was a term that was invented over the last few years by the main secessionist Serb nationalist party in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the SNSD, most of whose senior leadership at this point is under American and British sanctions. So the reason why I bring this up is we are seeing a growing degree of synergy between Croat nationalist and Serb nationalist politicians, both in Bosnia and in the region, vis-a-vis some of the basic facts of the existence of the Bosnian state and the events of the 1990s. So for instance, Bosnia is not a state union. The state of Bosnia-Herzegovina was not created in 1995 at Dayton. It traces its legacy as a sovereign state to March 1992, when it declares independence. That is when Bosnia-Herzegovina joins the United Nations. And as the first article, or rather as the preamble and first article of Bosnia-Herzegovina's constitution say, the state that was reorganized in 1995 carries with it the legal character of the state that preceded it. The reason why this language of state union is so significant and dangerous, and the way that I think it brings together all of the concerns that my colleagues have raised here and that we're kind of discussing here is, this is a new terminology meant to reanimate old political projects, because the argument here is Bosnia-Herzegovina is a state union. So that means that it was created in 1995, according to this narrative, that the respective units that were established by the Dayton Constitution, so the entities and the cantons, they themselves jointly form the Bosnian state. They don't, but this is the argument. And that if they form the Bosnian state, they also have the right to dissolve the Bosnian state. In other words, you're seeing the reanimation of the kind of secessionist project that people like Karadzic and Mate Boban had during the 1990s, that is being sort of reintroduced or reanimated into the political bloodstream of contemporary Bosnian politics. We have a very unfortunate situation right now in the context of the current political, during the current election debate, where I think if you were going to be quite honest, if you looked at the political rhetoric coming from the main nationalist political parties in the country, in particular the HDZ and the SNSD, to some extent also the SDA, which is the main Bosniak nationalist party, you would be hard pressed to find any meaningful difference between their rhetoric in the year 2022 versus say 1992. Right, it's virtually indistinguishable. I would say the one major difference is that in the case of the SDA, which again is the main Bosniak nationalist party, the one mitigating factor there is that the electorate for which they are competing for, which is the Bosniak electorate, which is the largest ethnic corpus, shall we say, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, is far and away also the most fragmented. And there is a far greater degree of political competition within that party. So most of the multi-ethnic and civic-oriented political parties in Bosnia-Herzegovina do disproportionately enjoy most of their political support, not exclusively, of course, from the Bosnian community, but disproportionately from the Bosnian community. That's also just a statistical reality, because at this point, the Bosnian community is some 51%, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, of the overall population in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So the SDA is to a certain extent having to compete with a greater number of rivals. And so the kind of politics that for instance, the HDZ and the SNSD are able to engage into, where we have unfortunately much more homogenous political electorates, is simply not plausible there. The structural issue, of course, here, and it's been alluded to by Lejla and Denis as well, of course, is that the Dayton Constitution, created and signed in 1995, Annex 4 of the Dayton Peace Accords, created a political system that disproportionately favors and privileges sectarian political actors. So Bosnia's constitution makes it actually very, very difficult for you to organize a political party and win political seats as a non-explicitly nationalist-oriented political bloc. Even at times when moderate and multi-ethnic parties have done reasonably well, which actually has happened on several occasions in Bosnia. We had major breakouts in 2000. We had major breakouts in 2010. We've had smaller episodes, but nevertheless distinct ones over the course of the 2010s. In particular, after the last elections, we saw some good results at the local levels, in particular in and around the Sarajevo area. Again, for multi-ethnic sort of civic, liberal, leftish parties, however you want to define them. There are so many institutional barriers within Bosnia's constitutional regime that so advantage these nationalist actors that it becomes virtually impossible to translate even very significant popular mandates into political power. So the most obvious example of this, for instance, would be, again, the HDZ party, which at the last national elections in 2018 won 9.05, I believe, % of the overall vote. They won a little bit more, about 14% within the actual federation entity. Thanks to that very modest political result, that party has been successfully able to block government formation in the federation entity for the entirety of the previous political mandate. So for about 4 years, they've successfully prevented the appointment of judges to the Constitutional Court of the Federation entity. So this is a very, very tiny party, realistically speaking. Overall political support somewhere between 9 to 12% overall, 14 if you want to be very generous. And they can completely shut down governance. Whereas parties that win significantly more political support, depending on how you want to count, if you combine the total vote share of the multi-ethnic civic parties in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you're talking about potentially as much as 25 to 30% of the overall electorate, a very significant portion of the electorate, actually, at least a quarter of the electorate. Those parties have a very hard time translating that into any kind of meaningful power. And then on top of that, which is something also that Lejla was referring to in terms of the kind of the overall political narratives and discourses, you then also have the problem that when moderate multi-ethnic candidates are elected, they are delegitimized in the discourses and narratives of nationalist parties for being, false representatives of their people. So for instance, if you are a moderate, non-nationalist, quote unquote, pro-Bosnian oriented Serb or Croat, of whom we have a number of prominent individuals who we could cite at this juncture, including, for instance, one of the mayors of one of the largest municipalities in Sarajevo, one of the members of the state presidency, one of the primary candidates for the state presidency in the RS entity, et cetera, et cetera. These people are not real Serbs, real Croats, real Bosniaks on down the list. And then, of course, we could also go into and I don't want to go into this because I'm conscious of the time, but I'll just say as a kind of final comment, we then, of course, have the very fact that from a kind of purely legal political standpoint, it's virtually impossible to identify merely as a Bosnian, right? So for political candidates and individuals who really only want to be considered as being citizens of the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are so many institutional legal barriers to them using that identity, carrying that identity forward, that it's, again, functionally impossible. So we have a constitutionally, institutionally sectarian and segregated society, which of course only benefits hardline reactionary nationalist political actors, and that fundamentally is far and away the biggest reason why Bosnia and Herzegovina has kind of continued to be stuck in this dead loop of recycling war traumas, revisionist histories, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, thank you all for your keynotes. That was already a lot. My first question, which just came up, like you mentioned that there's moderate candidates and politicians, so they are in positions, but they are delegitimized by other politicians. But do they have, like, what's with the people? Like, do they have do they also delegitimize them, or is there more people who are not politicians who want to go that way? But like, is there a gap between the people and the politicians?
So I think one of the facts of kind of daily political life in Bosnia, and I'm sure this is something Denis and Lejla can also speak to, I think there's a very significant degree of suspicion, antipathy, and hostility to the idea of politics among ordinary Bosnians and Herzegovinians. Like, politics is a dirty word in Bosnia. And the reason for that is that the political system is perceived to be corrupt and criminalized, and to be part of it in any shape, way, or form is to yourself be corrupt and criminalized. So the idea of being like a people's champion, or an advocate for the people, is something that really is kind of unheard of in modern day politics, including among sort of the moderate and multi-ethnic candidates. I think on the whole they generally have a better reputation, but I think anyone who in any shape, way, or form has been, I will use the term loosely, active in Bosnian political life, which actually includes people like, being involved in civil society or the NGO sector, even journalists. To be part of public life is to put yourself on the receiving end of an incredible amount of hostility and toxicity. Like every time I'm on television, it doesn't matter what I say, I know that the comment section is going to be filled with hundreds and hundreds of ethnic slurs, homophobic slurs, whatever. It's a very, very toxic political culture. And I do fundamentally think that is the result of the Dayton Constitution. I mean, it is a constitution that is, I think, ironically, or perversely, perhaps more accurately, done everything conceivable to elevate the worst and most toxic elements in society to the highest levels possible. Whereas everyone that sort of has any kind of modicum of moderation, humility, progressive instincts, et cetera, has to work very, very hard to just survive the constant onslaught of hostility, toxicity, and unfortunately, in some cases, even violence.
Do you want to add something, Denis or Lejla?
No, nothing particularly. I definitely totally agree with Jasmin. It's certainly a reality. I don't think this is done, that this has happened. I only wanted to add that this hasn't happened, I think, in and of itself. It's something that has been perpetuated by the leading nationalistic elites. Their interest is not in elevating democratic discussion and elevating the idea of any kind of civic state or progress. And I think that for them, the idea is always to mobilize people by fear. And when people vote by fear, they don't need to really be happy with their choice. So I think that really they understand the fact that their profile can never be a positive one. So what they actively try to do is really make the situation as such that people see every politician the same way, and in that way they, among many equals, will vote for the ones that they feel can protect them.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, just to add, basically, I do completely agree with what Jasmin and Denis just shared with us, but at the same time, I would also like to emphasize how much corruption is present in our politics, and how much that in that way it impacts on the choices of the people, like who you gonna vote for, who you will support, will your job, employment depends on political party. If you are working for administration, the changes in political landscape definitely will influence your position if you are on some kind of leading position. I mean, this is something that unfortunately all transitional countries or states are facing with, but I completely agree with Jasmin. Dayton Peace Agreement opened many doors for many instruments, but also many ways how to capture the state and how keep the state captured, like how to preserve everything that is not democratic, as Denis said, but at the same time, how to keep people in fear and not to allow them basically other choices than those free nationalistic leading parties are offering to.
You mentioned earlier that last year there was the change from the High Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which imposed to change the criminal code, which prohibits the denial of genocide and glorification of war criminals. What was the reactions to that, and like what does that mean in practice? I mean, it's not so long time ago, but yes. And also, like Lejla, you're working with the law. What do you think is the importance of legal implementations in this situation?
Yes, it was really important to have these changes, because before the High Representative actually imposed these changes of the criminal law. There were several attempts from the state parliament to change these laws or to introduce completely new law on this matter, but it was unsuccessful for all the time. So we had these attempts on the level of the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we had it on the level of Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as you said, basically, which is also composed mainly of Bosniaks and Croats. So blaming only Serbs for not being on the side to adopt this law is just not correct, because there was no political will to have this kind of this piece of legislation, because that will limit all three major nationalistic parties, as Jasmin said, in producing and maintaining the narratives about the war, and also using denial, but also glorification or justification of war crimes and war criminals. So when these attempts were not successful, and under, I would say, pressure of like victims and survivors, civil society organizations, media, specialized professionals, etc., at certain point, and that was during the leaving on the very last days of Valentin Inzko, High Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina, he decided to use bone jurisdiction to impose these changes. That means basically that is not allowed anymore on the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina to deny verdicts of where where facts have been established about war crimes, and not only that certain event was war crime, but also other elements of war crimes, such as number of the killed people, number of displaced people, and stuff like that. So this is one point, and another point is banning basically glorification of war criminals, basically the one that are consisted in the same verdicts. But this means that no more any streets, public places, commemorations, and other things could be done in terms to glorify or celebrate war crimes or war criminals. That, in the first place, meant a heavy reaction from Milorad Dodik, the member of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and leader of the nationalistic party from Republika Srpska. That also meant reinterpretation or misuse of this, like something that is directed towards ethnic group, towards Serbs, and not something that should basically bring peace, and something that should basically provide a respectful relationship towards the facts established during the criminal proceedings. But it was really, really misused to also start some other processes, such as blocking state institutions, again, threats with separation of the entity of Republika Srpska from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in some cases, it really brings up the discussion. I mean, it was not the real discussion, and it's not completely correct, but that this provoked another critical moment. But I would say it did not. This was the reaction, something that should be done many years before. So I think Denis can add to this a lot. What is the effect of this law? What we saw is definitely the reduced statements, and definitely stop naming the streets, the public places, glorification of war criminals, not completely, but we can see it less in public discourse. We can see it less in political discourse. But at the same time, you know, when you go to Serbia or to Croatia, you can again, without any sanction, deny the genocide in Srebrenica and not to be punished for that. I mean, this is the something that we should face with. Of course, implementation of legislation that we have, even it is adopted or imposed by high representative, should be on the first place. But at the same time, I have to share disappointment, let's call it that way, with the prosecution in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which received a number of reports of different kind of breaking this law, but at the same time, we still have started non-process on this issue. So it's been over a year. when from the imposing this law and have it as a positive law in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but at the same time, I'm not sure what prosecution and will judiciary basically approach to this seriously and basically start to implement the law in terms when some kind of breaching the law is happening.
Right. If I may just add a few things, basically totally agree with Lejla. In BIRN, we have a database that we monitor. It's called Mapping Hate. And the idea is to monitor hateful incidents, hateful rhetoric by politicians, and then also the implementation of this law, which, as I mentioned, it's a key hateful rhetoric that's being used by politicians. And basically, what we found is that, as Lejla mentioned, we've had this law for a year and a month about at this point in time. We only have about 20 instances in which politicians or public officials have actually either denied war crimes, so not just the Srebrenica genocide, but we've had instances of other war crimes being denied as well, or glorified convicted war criminals, or put plaques in place to glorify certain convicted persons, which is all things that are denied, that are banned by this law. Now, that's really what Lejla explains. That's a huge success story. Basically, before that, in the month before that, we had Milorad Dodik, in and of just this one individual, denying the Srebrenica genocide at least 15 times. And that's a regular month for him. So really, this situation, which we've only had a handful of incidents of public rhetoric where war crimes, genocide is being denied or war criminals being glorified, is a huge, huge success story. It's really made really good progress. However, the key issue is what Lejla is speaking about at the very end, is that we are seeing in the last 2 weeks, when we are in an election campaign, that politicians are really testing these limits. So we have seen them using, for instance, we've had an instance a couple of days ago where a convicted war criminal died, and we've had really eulogies where where this person was glorified. Now, they really are testing the limits to see whether or not the Bosnian prosecution will act. And what we do know is that the Bosnian State Prosecutor's Office is really politically trapped, as all other institutions in the country are, and basically they are refusing to prosecute these cases. I can give a really plastic example. For instance, during the implementation of this law, a plaque was put in the place where Ratko Mladić, the convicted war criminal, lined up Bosnian Serb soldiers above the city of Sarajevo during the siege. Now, basically, the Bosnian prosecution saw this and they refused to raise an indictment. So they're still in the investigation phase. And we asked them several times why. And this was the explanation. They said there was a plaque there before and it was removed. And then they put it on back again just during this year. So we're not sure that actually qualifies as a new plaque, despite the fact that it is a new plaque. And then the second logic that they used was that the plaque actually says Ratko Mladić, the commander of the Bosnian Serb army, in this place during at some date, lined up members of this and this unit here. And they said, like, the text doesn't actually glorify him, as if, the mere idea of you putting a plaque someplace, naming who is this commander who lined up soldiers there, isn't in and of itself a glorification. So really what they're trying to do is using technicalities in order not to implement this law.
Okay. So time is running. So yes, if you have questions from the audience, you can. I have one last question before I open. You can already type them into the chat, or you can raise your hand. Yes. So my last question. Now we talked a lot about what is not going so well, but Jasmin, in your book, you said that the major hope is in grassroots movements. And Dennis, you are working also in some projects or together with some projects of oral history, which I don't know how long this exists, but maybe, yes, maybe can shortly dive into this and you can present quickly these projects of oral history and maybe the hopes those projects give, or in general, Lejla, you talked about alternative ways to remember. Jasmin spoke about grassroots movements. So yes, maybe you want to start, Dennis, with those oral history projects.
Yeah, certainly. So basically, the idea that we had, we started this first project with the Srebrenica Memorial Center a couple of about a year and a half before the law was banning genocide in Lejla was enacted, and basically that was really the, let's say, the most heightened narratives of denial that we have ever seen up until that point. Really, denying genocide was a daily occurrence by Serb politicians. And what we wanted to do, because very little was working in terms of actually providing, let's say, a counter narrative to that, was to actually like push the conversation back into that there were actually real lives behind the numbers, behind the number of 7,000 or 8,000 people killed in the genocide and 40,000 women and children and older people expelled. And we wanted to really kind of, quote unquote, force people, ordinary people who are the victims of this disinformation, to really think when they see these videos and these short stories and these artifacts of individuals, to really think like, this is extremely hurtful what politicians are doing here. These are the people. I can see the person whose child or husband or father has been killed in this crime. So we did a project with Srebrenica Memorial Center where 100 people who survived the genocide or whose victims or whose family members were killed gave artifacts of their loved ones. And we also developed a methodology, actually, the Srebrenica Memorial Center developed a specific methodology where oral history was collected from them. So they weren't just speaking about the actual atrocities, but about life in Srebrenica before the genocide and during the genocide, to really highlight this notion and this fact that there was actually a life before this crime, and that's what was actually taken away by the actual crime and the atrocity. And we hope that that would really humanize this element of these atrocities so much that it would prove to be a successful counter narrative to the denialist and revisionist narratives. And then later on, this year, when we are marking 30 years since the start of the siege of Sarajevo, we also did a project where we filmed 44 persons for every month of the siege, and they told individual stories about their actual memories of the siege specific to that kind of month that we're talking about. And we also didn't want it to be 44 persons talking about atrocities, but some of them spoke about really positive things, art during the siege and sport during the siege, and all of these things that can show that the life and the depth of the stories. And what we're really hoping to do with this is to use these kind of journalistic techniques that really focus on individual stories, which more people can connect to, in order to kind of force them to rethink about being platforms through social media to spread hateful and revisionist or denialist rhetorics.
Jasmin, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would just say very quickly, I think, you know, there is always an inbuilt hope in in grassroots mobilization. I think I have to say that, you know, we saw a relatively broad-based regional wave of civil society mobilization over the latter half of the 2010s. I think that wave has largely dissipated. And we are now, unfortunately, once again, in a very tense political moment across the region where a lot of, you know, state-funded, state-activated, government-run policies and programs, which really are, you know, I describe them as revanchists. They are reanimating the politics of the 1990s, and this is a regional phenomenon. We see what the Serbian government is doing in Montenegro, Bosnia, and Kosovo. We see what Croatia is doing in Bosnia. Hell, if you even want to go sort of outside of field, we can see what Bulgaria is doing in Macedonia, or North Macedonia rather. So, you know, we're unfortunately in a very, very ugly moment. It is to some extent can be sort of historically and politically understood in the context of, unfortunately, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And we've seen just over the last 24 hours or so the situation in Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is a very, very tense political moment. And I think, unfortunately, at this juncture, from my vantage point, we are more likely to see the continuation of these kinds of revanchist politics for the next, I don't want to say necessarily the next several years, but certainly the next several months. You know, I expect we're going to see further incidents on the Serbia-Kosovo border. I think we're going to have a very, very ugly situation in Bosnia after October once the elections are done. We're almost certainly going to see the HDZ and the SNSD trying to hold up government formation, and that may potentially eventually result in some kind of minor security incidents. We are going to see Serbia and Russia continuing to interfere in the politics of neighboring states, including Bosnia, including Montenegro, including Kosovo. We're going to see Croatia continue to do the same in Bosnia. This is unfortunately not the kind of environment in which civil society can make very strong headway, because, you know, as unromantic as it sounds, I think civil society has a hard time organizing against intelligence services on armed forces, right? That's an unrealistic expectation to have. And the expectation that we should have is of the European Union and of NATO to have a more consistent red line approach to unacceptable behavior by local governments. But unfortunately, we've not seen a lot of that over the last few years. We may see more of that in the coming months and years, but for the time being, I'm not particularly hopeful.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 questions already. I think, Gisela, you raised your hand, so you wanted to talk.
Well, I'm Gisela from Leipzig also, like Edith. And when Denis just described some progress in remembrance culture, I was a little bit more, let's say, hopeful. But just right now, after Jasmin's description of the situation, I'm asking myself, I listened to such discussions since decades. It's now 27 years after Dayton. Lejla said the young generation is much more interested in their own future rather than in politics, which is considered as a dirty subject. What's about you? Do you have really any hope for your country or for the region? I'm also reading information about Serbia and Kosovo and all what Jasmin just mentioned, but it is rather depressing than giving some hope for a solution. Sometimes we thought, okay, we need the next generation, and they will do, and they will progress in the country. And in between, there were some hopes. Yes, there are changes. But right now, it's the same like the election rallies 4 years ago, 8 years ago, and do we have any hope? And do you have any recipe what to do?
So I think I'll be very quick, and I just wanted to jump in on this, and I'll say before I answer, I have a little bit of experience with what I would call sort of the German policy culture, having worked for a number of German Stiftungen. My family were refugees in Hanover during the 90s. I speak German. So I think I have a little bit of an understanding for how Germans have historically thought about the Balkans, both from a kind of civil society standpoint and I think a political standpoint. And I think we made a mistake collectively in anticipating that reconciliation, quote unquote, in the Western Balkans was going to look like what happened between Germany and France after 1945. That was the wrong model. And I think reconciliation in the Western Balkans is going to have to look a lot more like essentially what happened between the Baltics and Russia after the 1990s, which is to say it's not reconciliation, actually. It's affirming the basic political facts and the political order of the region as we need it to be, which is to say, I don't think we can expect reconciliation between Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia at this juncture. What we can do is absolutely underline the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all of the states in the region, that we can work to bring Bosnia into NATO, Kosovo into NATO, that we make sure that North Macedonia and Albania join the European Union, that we kind of think about this from a strategic standpoint rather than, I think, this kind of broad-based, I think oftentimes extremely unclear and diffuse and oftentimes almost kind of quasi-metaphorical way of like, well, let's just get reconciliation. Well, what does reconciliation mean? If you say to somebody who's a survivor of genocide, we need reconciliation, the question is, what do you want me to do? What is it that you're expecting of me to say to somebody like Aleksandar Vučić or Ana Brnabić or Zoran Milanović? What's the halfway point between my family is dead and you're saying it didn't happen? Right? That's the fundamental problem. And so I think when we talk about reconciliation, what reconciliation requires is stable ground for that to take place. And it is unreasonable and unfair of us to expect young people today, or somebody even like myself, who was, for instance, 5.5, 6 when the war broke out, for us to be sort of collectively given the task of peace and reconciliation when the politics that destroyed these societies in the first place are still very, very active. So I think the very first thing and the fundamental thing that needs to happen is we need to make sure that those kinds of politics not so much go away, because they're going to keep being there one way or another, but we need to make sure that they have no practical political and security implications. Meaning people like Milorad Dodik, Aleksandar Vučić, Zoran Milanović, they cannot be allowed to act on their politics. And that requires basically hard security guarantees. And I think a lot of what's happened in the region over the last 10 and 15 years, not going back to 95, going back to, for instance, since 06 or 10, is that those security guarantees disappeared. And people in the region got scared. They got really scared. And a lot of reactionary politicians capitalized on that. I have to just remind us that we had an incident in Macedonia in 2015 where the parliament was stormed. The prime minister was beaten on the ground, or on the floor of the parliament. The incoming defense minister was bludgeoned. She was nearly killed. The speaker of the parliament. It's not just, it's not just Bosnia, it's the whole region. And it's because those fundamental Western and Atlantic security guarantees disappeared and they dissipated, that we had a very, very significant period of backsliding, which is not yet ended and from which we still don't necessarily have a way forward. And again, we see what's going on in Montenegro and Kosovo these days. That situation is unfortunately getting worse. My last kind of categorical fear, though, is just that given the scale of the violence in Bosnia during the 90s, the 140 to 150,000 people that were killed in the Yugoslav wars in their entirety, 100,000 were killed in Bosnia. Those kinds of incidents in Bosnia can get out of hand much, much more quickly than they have gotten in any of the other regional countries. They've been dangerous there as well, but in Bosnia, I think they would be really, really catastrophic. So we need to be very, very, cognizant of the security implications in all of this.
Okay, thank you, Jasmin. Denis needs to leave now. Do you want to have a final speech?
Yeah, no, just a few words. I think that this is a really important topic, and I'm really happy that it's gaining more international attention. I think that the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina is really, really complex. It's important not to take in that we have seen a bit of deterioration of the most hateful rhetoric during the last few months, because we've had so much international attention as something that's going to continue even if internationals leave. So I think we need to continue to have international support for these for the improvement of the situation. Unfortunately, as Jasmin mentioned, as Lejla mentioned, that the constitution is so complex and the country is so politically trapped by these political elites that we really are unfortunately reliant on outside assistance to address some of these key issues. And Bosnia needs to have that assistance. It needs to have a clear European future in order for the country to stay stable. And I hope that continues. And memory and history and wartime atrocities and fact-based narratives are key to that. And thank you for the invitation, and sorry after.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us and for your input. Okay. There was one more question, but before, Lejla, do you want to also add something to the question before?
Yes, if I may, I'll try to be really brief, having time on my mind. So basically, in terms to ask someone who lives in Bosnia and Herzegovina if there is optimism, am I optimistic over our future? Well, I think for the first, we have to be realistic, and reality is quite ugly, and it is quite frustrating on the daily basis. This is not only about politics, this is not only about research, this is not only about what we do, but how we live here, and what are the conditions for the living in Bosnia and Herzegovina, not only regarding the remembrance politics, but also in terms of how our everyday life looks like. And I already mentioned corruption. We already mentioned several times impact of the media. We already mentioned the political situation in the country. But at the same time, young people are finding different kind of solution, and that solution is to leave the country. This is something that is happening in last, I would say, 5 years very extensively. And we have heavy brain drain from Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially from small cities, from small communities. And we are losing those people because not only to get better conditions for life, but they are just being fed up with everything that is happening here in health institutions, in educational institutions. And all of this is just result or consequence of nationalistic politics, where everything is divided by some kind of ethnic lines and corruption, unfortunately. So remembrance comes and like mentioning possibilities of war, separation of the countries, different creating third entity by Croats and stuff like that. It becomes like cherry on the top of the cake, you know, like it's not something that we see in our everyday life, but we are listening and we are exposed to that. And it's not easy, and definitely it's difficult to be optimistic, but at the same time, if you want to live here, if you are decisive over that decision, then you will do anything you can to basically improve situation in not only in your life, but also in a small community, and definitely on political level, if possible. So the answer would be, I definitely see that there is hope for us. And I definitely see that we should not give up, because if this is like last corridor of defense of the citizens' rights and like something that could be done in terms of reconciliation as such, but also fighting for the better future here. And I would just emphasize, I would just add one example how close we are to those war feelings, and like how close we are in our heads to the war. When the pandemic outbreak happened 2 years ago, the main comment here in Bosnia and Herzegovina was like, it looks like a war. You know, like, and this shows you how very vividly those remembrance and those memories live and stay with us, and how we basically did not dealt with it in a right way.
So there was another question before, and it says, are there any common commemoration projects between Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia or Serbia or other former countries of the former Yugoslav Republic?
I think there's been a number of civil society-led initiatives. The Youth Initiative for Human Rights, which is an organization that is active throughout the region. I think their Serbian chapter is quite active. There's been several attempts at various kinds of school textbooks and publications that have attempted to sort of create a uniform narrative of one shape, form or another, or at least recognizing the multiplicity of narratives about certain key events. For the most part, however, at the political level, this is non-existent. For instance, it goes to almost absurd lengths, right? So for instance, I think it was Lejla might be able to correct me last year or the year before that one of the members of the Bosnian presidency, I believe it was the Bošnjak member of the presidency, went to Vukovar in Croatia to commemorate the siege and the fall of the city during the Croatian War of Independence. This was seen as a sort of kind gesture, a good gesture, a gesture of solidarity, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, in Bosnia, in certain aspects of the Croat nationalist press, it was portrayed as being extremely cynical, extremely, sort of politically contentious, and then, of course, now you have, again, to sort of bring back the example of Zoran Milanović, the Croatian president, now explicitly denying the genocide in Srebrenica. It's a very, very complex and convoluted situation with that. And again, as I mentioned sort of in my opening comments, it goes down to even the World War II period. So for instance, over the past few months, we've had a very contentious, I don't know whether to call it a scandal or an ongoing story about whether or not the president of Serbia would be allowed to visit the site of the Jasenovac death camp that was run by the Ustaša regime, where tens of thousands of Serbs, Jews, Roma were killed during the 1940s. Aleksandar Vučić's family has family that he traces back to that were killed at Jasenovac. He wanted to visit the site. The Croatian authorities were sort of unclear as to why they were not allowing him. It became sort of a political scandal. At the same time, for instance, Milorad Dodik, the Serb member of the state presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, who's a genocide denier and is a secessionist, has frequently visited Jasenovac. And on down the list we go, and not even getting into the whole thing between Serbia and Kosovo, and Račak and the various sort of atrocities perpetrated by the Serbian security services. So at the political level, we have almost completely distinct and separate political narratives. The one exception that I would say is Montenegro, where the Montenegrin authorities over the last few years have generally been much more compromising and sort of correct, for lack of a better term, both vis-a-vis Bosnia and Croatia. But there again, now we have a sort of ongoing political tumult in Montenegro, where the current government appears to be taking a slightly different position on all those questions. And we had an incident a couple months back during the Srebrenica commemorations in July, where the now prime minister, or prime minister in a technical mandate, who's ostensibly from a reform party, is an ethnic Albanian himself, gave a speech at the memorial complex in Srebrenica, which just was, to be very diplomatic, I will say it was extremely strange and extremely poorly worded, and it caused something of a diplomatic incident between Bosnia and Montenegro. So at the formal level, no, there's really no meaningful joint commemoration that we can cite.
If I may jump in, just with a short info, like we had few bright moments in the history in maybe 10 years or more, with the public apologies from the high position politicians in the region, from the Croatia, from the Serbia, from the Montenegro, and that was I would say maybe the brightest moments, but those kind of politicians and those kind of politics are far away. And I think Jasmin elaborated how we can see rise of the nationalistic and ethnic tensions very recently, and this is definitely a phenomenon. But at the same time, completely agree, we haven't spoke about Second World War and the commemoration that could be used and should be used as something that could be done between the states and in the region. But at the same time, we are very much witnessing the about erasing these memories and erasing this part of identity, the joint identity, and definitely destroying many monuments during the 90s war, but also after the war. And this is really sending clear message about like being finished with that part of the history and basically really wanting to erase.
Okay, I'm going to overtime a bit, but there's one last question where I want to ask, add something. So this question goes to Jasmin regarding the security guarantees from Western countries for and in the region. What would be good perspectives for the near future? Are EUFOR troops or other Western military programs helping and bringing security, or does it escalate the ongoing troubles? And I would add my question to that, because you mentioned it also several times, like both of you. Lejla, you also wrote some papers about the EU integration and demands, like what are the demands, what steps should take the EU or Germany, what is their responsibility in all that? Yeah.
So specifically as concerns EUFOR, we're going to have to see now in October what exactly will happen with EUFOR. There is some indication that Russia will attempt to veto the extension of the mandate for EUFOR at the UN Security Council. What the exact consequences of that will be is a little bit unclear at this juncture. There is some indication from diplomatic sources that what that will mean is that NATO will resume essentially peacekeeping operations in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We've just had the US ambassador to NATO in Sarajevo in a visit. And again, there is some sort of political and diplomatic chatter that decision has effectively already been made. I don't want to get into the weeds, but it does bear stating that EUFOR has been understaffed for a very, very long time. EUFOR is at this point somewhere around 1,500 or 1,600 troops, so 1,500, 1,600 thereabouts, maybe a little bit less. In fact, that is well under where it needs to be, especially in the context of sort of very credible secessionist threats in the RS. At this point, I think it's widely understood, even among EUFOR commanders, that this is an over-the-horizon force, meaning EUFOR itself does not have the capacity to, as it is on the ground, EUFOR does not have the means to prevent any kind of serious breakout of violence. To be quite blunt, the RS police is better armed than EUFOR at this juncture. So EUFOR would have to rely on what are referred to as over-the-horizon forces, which is essentially backup that would theoretically arrive somewhere in the neighborhood of 48 to 72 hours, maybe even longer, to deal with the situation. That's not ideal. Because it's unclear what can, as we've seen in Ukraine, as we've seen in Armenia, Azerbaijan, a lot can happen in 72 hours. From my perspective, I think the long-term security perspective for Bosnia-Herzegovina has to be getting the country itself into NATO, rather than maintaining a permanent sort of foreign force on the soil of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which I don't have an objection to, but that's not a solution. That's a stopgap measure. And really what we have to work towards is getting Bosnia-Herzegovina formally into NATO. I think just one point very specifically on that, and then I'll stop. There is a lot of, I think, misinformation and misunderstanding about that, what that would actually involve for Bosnia, because there is political opposition on the part of the secessionist authorities in the RS. However, by law, Bosnia-Herzegovina has stated as its foreign policy ambitions, not just membership in NATO, but it has formally tasked all state-level institutions with preparing the ground and preparing the institutional mechanisms for Bosnia and Herzegovina joining NATO. This is Bosnian law. It was signed into law by the RS authorities as well. This is the defense law that created the Bosnian armed forces. So from a political standpoint, the fact that Milorad Dodik or whoever else might at this juncture be opposed to NATO membership, in a really meaningful sense of the term, doesn't matter, because the law is the law. And so in that sense, I think hopefully in the next decade or so, we're going to see a slightly more aggressive campaign, both by Bosnian officials and NATO officials to get Bosnia and Herzegovina into NATO, which I think would provide a very credible long-term security guarantee for the country.
You want to add something, Lejla? Maybe? No? Okay. Okay, there's one message. Yes. So how will you want it to refer to something? Maybe you can do it really quickly before we have some closing words.
Apparently I can't start my video. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There, it started. So we have a comment from Lejla about denial of war crimes. We have a comment from Jasmin about simply affirming the facts. And we have a comment from Denis about having a, I won't call it European future, but a rules-based future. This is a very small point and a very small beacon of hope, but law from the war crimes trials in former Yugoslavia has come into Australian jurisprudence, Australian law on forced labour, servitude and slavery. This has been an enormously helpful and very constructive and productive contribution from the conflict. It does nothing to ease your pain, but it may be at some point there is benefit for you in referring to this example from outside, where your experience is acknowledged and affirmed and valued. That's all.
Thank you so much for this contribution. Maybe this is leading into my final question. Maybe quickly, if you can answer it quickly, or if you want to answer, what can we all learn from Bosnia, maybe?
I guess I would just say very quickly that, I think there's two things. One, you can never underestimate the extent to which malign reactionary politics can destroy social bonds, even in extremely well-integrated societies, which Bosnia was prior to the war. Famously, fully a third of all marriages in Bosnia and Herzegovina were quote unquote mixed marriages. Politics requires, violence requires planning and orchestration, and we very much saw that in Bosnia, and that should be taken seriously and confronted. That's one. The second thing is, I don't think we can underestimate the extent to which, reactionary and hateful ideas can live on and be passed down through generations, again, unless they are confronted. And unfortunately, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, both local and international authorities have failed to sufficiently confront kind of the politics of xenophobia, violence, and hate.
Yes, I would say most of the things that we can learn from our experience is not how to do things in post-conflict society and transitional society, but seriously, like how not to deal with the past. This is what we can learn from here. Like, this is not enough just to implement one pillar of the transitional justice. It is not enough to set international agreement as something that is set in a stone and not changeable. We should not definitely see international community as a only resource for the troubles and solution in this kind of country. We should definitely not look on transitional period as something that will never end, and we definitely should learn more about how to establish democratic principles instead of ethnic principles for every single part of our lives. So maybe not sound very optimistic, but this is definitely something that we can learn from. And what we should also learn from, and Edith, you posted that question before, where are we on the European Union path? I think we should be there, and I think it depends a lot on our politicians and our political elites. But at the same time, there is some kind of responsibility of both Germany, European Union, other European countries, because some battles that Jasmin mentioned during this evening are really happening in European Union, because, for example, Croatia is a full member of European Union and has those instruments inside to work against joint and citizen state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, promoting separatistic but also very nationalistic things in European Union against Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we see that unfortunately with electoral law here in Bosnia and Herzegovina and possible changes that will maybe happen or being imposed by new high representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina now. So there is a lot to learn. There are some really positive steps, but I would those positive steps and positive examples assign mostly to civil society and to those who are basically still standing here and wanting to change and want to overcome these ethno-nationalistic divisions that do exist in Bosnia and Herzegovina even 27 years after. But these 27 years could be taken as a good basis, as a good examples how to do things and what to learn from where we are standing now.
Okay, I think this is really strong closing words. Thank you so much for being here today and for everything you said. The time went by so quickly. I have so many more questions, and yeah, I would love to talk more with you also about transitional justice. We didn't even could explain what this is. I hope we can have another talk someday. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing today.
Thank you for having us.
For your work.
Thank you.
Yes, and to everyone else, thank you so much for listening. And this is it now, but we will also publish this talk on our website so more people can see it. And I hope we continue someday to that talk. Bye. Thank you.